Thank you to the meeting organizers, Jeffrey Gerber and Rod Taylor. It's a pleasure to be here at Low Carb Vail. And I'm going to, in the words of Monty Python, now comes something completely different, okay? So let's go back to diabetes, not this cholesterol thing. And I'm going to talk about Lchf and diabetes, the theory, and then the clinical experience. My background, I approached Dr. Atkins at the same time Jeff Volek did around 1998 to say, why don't you do some research on this? I want to thank the Atkins Center and Atkins Nutritionals and Colette Heimowitz and Jackie Eberstein along the way who've taught me. I want to thank Ron Rosedale, Mike and Mary Dan Eads, Steve Finney, Jeff Volek, all the clinical people. So I'm here to try to bring together the clinical and the research. We did clinical trials at Duke for about 15 years. And then I've been in clinical practice, blissfully happy and busy, like you've heard, using Lchf to fix lots of things today. So we also have one of the only medical school electives that teach ketogenic diets. It's the Medical Management of Obesity elective at Duke. I'm chairman of the Obesity Medicine Association, meaning the past president. And if you ever have a choice, don't be the president of an organization when they change their name. That's what gave me some humor this year, Jeffrey, I think. I'm a fellow of the Obesity Society, where we present our research on obesity in the US, and a fellow of the Obesity Medicine Association as well. I'm an author on The New Atkins for a New You, also author with Jimmy Moore, and thank you, Jimmy Moore, for forcing me to take a stance on cholesterol and ketogenic diets, and so I'm a co-author on cholesterol clarity and keto clarity as well. So telling a professor of medicine to only speak for 30 minutes is really tough. You know, I've gotten to that point where I can speak in front of people when they're falling asleep and still go on. So let's go back in time. Actually, about 100 years ago, before there was any heart disease. Heart disease was a rare event at this time. But diabetes was known, and the treatment of diabetes, Elliot Proctor Joslin was one of the prime teachers at the time. In 1893, he recommended a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, as shown in the case description of this patient, Mary H. Dietetic treatment is of the first importance. Remember, this is 1893. The carbohydrates taken in the food are of no use to the body and must be removed by the kidneys, thereby entailing polydipsia, polyuria, pruritus, and renal disease. That's lots of thirst, lots of urine, and itching and renal disease. Mary H. was put on a stringent diet consisting only of protein and fat. The beneficial effects were seen at once. She gained 5 or 6 pounds and was advised to eat all the cream, butter, and fatty food possible. Why are you laughing? It's what I use today, honestly. Frederick, it's not just Elliot Joslin. Joslin Clinic, Boston, today, is the clinic's named after him. Frederick Allen was the one who really did a lot of the research. In the treatment of diabetes mellitus in humans, Allen employed fasting, then a stepwise reintroduction of macronutrients to find the threshold at which the urine glucose developed, glycosuria. First, the patient was fasted, no food, until glycosuria, urine sugar, was no longer present. Then carbohydrates in the form of green vegetables were introduced. We would call them low glycemic or non-starchy vegetables today. Starting at 10 grams per day, total grams, not net grams, no sugar alcohols, none of these other things today, and increased until the glycosuria threshold was reached, till urine was seen, glucose was seen in the urine. They couldn't check blood glucose at the time, so they were using urine. Today we know we can do better than urine, we can actually check the blood. The carbohydrate intake prior to the appearance of glycosuria was considered the optimal amount of carbohydrate. This level was maintained, and then protein was added to the diet, beginning 1 to 1.5 grams of protein today, which is interesting. That's the recommendation by all of the pundits today after all of the research we've been doing, even when you're losing weight, 1 gram to 1.5 grams of protein per day. To find the glycosuria threshold for the combination of carbohydrate and protein. So it was known in the early 1900s that protein in the food would increase the blood sugar and increase the urine sugar, even then. Finally, fat was added to the diet to provide calories for weight gain or weight maintenance, and fat was observed to have little effect on glycosuria because fat doesn't raise the blood sugar, won't raise the urine sugar. For some patients, a weekly fast day was recommended. Wow. So this was published or summarized by myself and Will Yancey from work in 1915. By serendipity, coincidence, however you say it, I was given this book, which is the Osler Principles and Practice of Medicine, published in 1923 by a patient of mine at the VA hospital in Durham, North Carolina, when I was doing one of the first re-studies of the low-carb, high-fat diets, and having one of the hospital directors being lobbied by my dietitian locally to stop the study because I would kill people. So this patient brought in, gee, doc, I knew you were kind of a history buff. I was a history major at Stanford, going to medical school in Wisconsin. That was my hometown. I look in the book, I didn't really know much about the treatment of, I didn't know much about nutrition, right? I'm a doctor, went through medical school in the 80s. We don't have any classes. What did they know in 1923? Well, lo and behold, this diet is the same diet I was studying in 2000 and trying to be squelched. So I thought something was curious to this. So the diabetic diet in the pre-insulin era, the quantity of food required by a severe diabetic patient weighing 60 kilograms was 10 grams of carbohydrate for the whole day. 75 grams of protein, 150 grams of fat, and 15 grams of alcohol. And when I show this slide, my patients want to volunteer for the study on alcohol. But the strict diet was meats, poultry, game, fish, clear soups, gelatin, eggs, butter, olive oil, coffee, and tea. Here are the research papers at the time. So I was really studying nothing new, although in the context of what you just heard about, 20 or 30 years of being told other things, this had been forgotten. And insulin hadn't been discovered. It didn't make it in until 1921. It didn't make it into this textbook, so there was nothing on insulin. The insulin story is fascinating, and no question, insulin saved lives immediately. So a child like this, who was emaciated and couldn't store fat without insulin, and that is, if there's a take-home message, the main function of insulin is to help you store fat when you're eating carbohydrates. I think the main function is actually amino acid uptake into the cells, but that's kind of a small player when you're eating lots of carbohydrates. So this little child on the left was one of the first to get insulin therapy, and you can see he plumped up really nicely after being able to get insulin, saved his life. Another child couldn't store fat because of type 1 diabetes, no insulin being secreted internally by the body, and now you give insulin on the outside, shoot a shot of insulin, and the child has lower blood sugars, doesn't have the disease of diabetes. It's treated with insulin, however. So insulin replacement therapy, before the discovery of insulin, an insulin type 1 diabetic would become emaciated because of the inability to store fat and the loss of energy from chronic sugar in the urine, glycosuria. Despite the high energy intake, no fat storage would occur. This was called starvation in the midst of plenty because the body would be thin despite large energy intake. So insulin therapy for insulin deficiency allowed individuals with type 1 diabetes to live. Miraculous. On the left side of this panel, type 1 diabetes, insulin deficiency. The remedy for insulin deficiency is to increase insulin. But on the right side of this panel, type 2 diabetes, especially when associated with obesity, is really a problem of insulin excess, hyperinsulinemia. As we saw the work by Dr. Kraft talked about by Dr. Gerber, there's too much insulin, creating insulin resistance. You're able to store fat, but you're unable to use the fat for energy. You have a fat body habitus, and you're starving due to glucose swings and constant fat storing because you can't access the fat. So the remedy is to reduce the insulin, not to increase it or use it. And so looking at the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes, very different than type 1, and using insulin is like winning the battle and losing the war in the long run. So there are other ways to do it than giving medications to fix diabetes. If you look at the guidelines, what happened over time, and you can read these, nobody really knows for sure. There was no pivotal study that said using medications and a high-carb diet is better than a low-carb diet. That study was never done. It needs to be done again today to put this on the put low-carb, high-fat on the same randomized trial evidence of everything else we assume, like drugs, and I think we need to do that. But all of the associations, I think Ansel Keys was a part of the association, associations getting online to use high-carb, low-fat diets for diabetics because they die of heart disease. And we all know now that fat in the diet causes heart disease around 1970. And so they stopped telling people with diabetes to reduce carbs, and they told them to reduce fat without regard to the carbs and the glycemic control, et cetera. So basically, a chronic disease was started called type 2 diabetes with insulin treatment and insulin resistance. And this young child is saying, I'm learning to manage my type 2 diabetes with insulin while he's eating all this stuff. It's kind of chilling to know that children actually are in this kind of situation. So what does the science say? I mean, okay, that's 100 years ago, Dr. Westman. I mean, well, 2005, Gunther Boden puts people with type 2 diabetes in on a research ward. We know exactly what they're eating. One of the main limitations of our work and other outpatient work, even with clinical trials, is we don't really know what people are eating. This is the best study if you want to know what happens with people where you know exactly what they're eating. Annals of Internal Medicine, 2005. You can see in the black bars, glucose is higher when they're eating their regular diet, and the glucose goes down on a low-carb diet, the open circles. And then on the bottom, the insulin levels go down, as you would expect. When you eat less carbohydrate, you have less insulin. This was taught as physiology and then forgotten, and now rediscovered in randomized trials that are very costly to do, may I add. But it's not just Gunther Boden. One of the first meetings like this in 2004, we got Dr. Bishop to come over from Europe to just show that if you didn't eat carbohydrate, the glucose didn't go up and the insulin didn't go up. Again, it's basic physiology that everyone had forgotten, but this is the replication or the first study. But no, that's okay. There's some more research, and if you want to make sure that it's on a different continent, that the humans who live in Australia are similar to the human. Anyway, so this is a study by Manny Noakes, the CSIRO in Australia, in Adelaide, and in red, when you have no carbs in the diet, the red lines, there's really no rise in glucose and no rise in insulin. And this study really stood out by saying, let's give a diet tolerance test, not a glucose tolerance test. It makes no sense to give someone on a low-carb diet glucose to see what happens. Let's give someone on a low-carb diet a meal that's low in carb and see what happens. So we're using methods and standards derived from carbohydrate eating and applying it to a different situation, which to me calls into question just about every theory that has been developed from that world. But so yeah, in diet-specific glucose tolerance or meal tolerance tests, there's no rise in glucose or insulin after not eating carbohydrates. When I was faced with, okay, it works for obesity, and I thought the low-hanging fruit would be, let's now use this for diabetes. 100 years ago, it's what they used. In the DCCT, which is a diabetes control trial, where they're using 230 grams of carbs per day in the intervention diet, the best they could do with medication in a high-carb diet was an A1C of 8.9 or 7.1%, normal being under 5% optimally or under 6%. So I went to visit doctors who were using this kind of diet in clinic, and under the best circumstances, when people are following the diet, which may be, you, not people in a randomized trial who may or may not be following it, they were achieving normal blood sugars off medication using a low-carb, high-fat diet. So I visited these practices, said, let's write up articles, and we did them. These are published and never cited. Am I going to? Sad but true. I didn't want to hurt anybody. Primum non nocere. Did you see that? First, do no harm. Do people really need to eat carbohydrate? world panel saying you must. World panel saying 120 grams are used by the brain of glucose, so you must eat 120 grams of glucose. Did they forget or maybe not know that the body can make glucose? When you look on who's on those panels, they didn't have physiologists. Didn't have people like Steve Phinney who did the studies were knowing. So I was presenting research on low-carb diets and people didn't believe me, so I had to start following one myself. And people would say, well, that can't be true. People need carbs. And I would say, I haven't had a carbohydrate in 6 months, and I'm here. And then suddenly people would believe the science. I mean, is there such a lack of faith in the research that nobody believes even? Well, so it's kind of crazy. So you really don't have to have carbohydrates. The Institute of Medicine in the U.S. has the best unbiased source of information about this, and look up on their website. The lower limit of dietary carbohydrate compatible with life apparently is 0, provided that adequate amounts of protein and fats are consumed. Even then you can see that's hedged a little bit, and we might even say the emerging evidence that it might even be healthier to not eat carbohydrate if we really updated that with this conference in Tampa just in January on metabolic therapeutics using ketones. It's fascinating to see this. And you need to look at the year that things were written because a lot has changed in the last 2 years, okay, let alone 10 years. I reviewed a paper recently where they looked at the guidelines from 2004 as throw them out. Look to Sweden, look to other places that have looked at data for carbohydrate restriction in type 2 diabetes. The daily study wasn't quite as low in carbs, down to 110 carbs per day. The Westman study, that's Will Yancey and I, really are the only ones who dared to go down to do what Frederick Allen and Osler did 100 years ago, the 20-gram, it's so low level. It's not so low, okay? It's okay. And what we found out in our 2008 study was that the low glycemic index diet works. No question about it. Low glycemic, low calorie will work for diabetes, but the low carb ketogenic diet worked better. So you're going to see people citing things that are fantastic. A lot of things work, and there are a lot of things that work for different people. But if you compare them head to head, the lower you go on the carbs, the better the glycemic control, recapitulating what had been known before the medications were available for the treatment of diabetes. So there's been a resurgence of research on this. Saslow, so Laura Saslow, Jeannie Tay, Satoru Yamada, and Dr. Meyer, who did a sub-study of the Duke study. Pretty much the same theme. You can improve diabetes, get weight loss. The good news, now that the pharmaceutical industry is in the obesity treatment world, we have studies on using medications to treat obesity and diabetes gets better. So if you want to use that information, I didn't use that here, but with the weight loss by whatever other method, surgery, medication, diet, you'll get weight loss and improvement in diabetes. But the lower you go on the carbs, the better you'll do, I think. And here's why. It's right in front of your face. And as a pimp question, meaning if one of my students or residents with me are really kind of jerks, I say, okay, how much sugar is there in the bloodstream at any given moment? You know, you can figure this out. The 2 Japanese medical students I've had taking my rotation at Duke knew just like that. I don't know if it's a millimole thing, but our students go, I say, okay, is 100 milligrams per deciliter is a normal blood sugar. Remember that thing now taught in middle school or grade school where you take 1,000 grams or whatever. There's 5 grams of sugar in the entire bloodstream at any given moment. It's roughly a teaspoon of sugar. I think the best written description I've seen of this, Mike, is at the Protein Power blog, where you go through this in text form. So basically, when you look from the blood sampling or blood situation, 5 grams going around at a given moment, and you throw in 200 grams in one meal, or let's say the diabetic recommendation, Diabetes Association of 45 grams per meal, this is going to overload the blood sugar. If you can't control it, the blood sugar is going to go up. Oh, we actually for a long time taught that it's normal to have an increase in blood sugar after a meal, because that's what everyone was doing. But is that optimal? Okay? So you don't have to have a blood sugar rise after a meal. There's a spoonful of sugar in the entire bloodstream. So what do I do today? The research money is drying up. You know, I'm a clinical doc, clinical research fellowship at Duke, but my heart really was in the clinic with patients. Let me go back to the clinic and start using this at Duke. We opened up the Duke Lifestyle Medicine Clinic now about 10 years ago. And teaching it, yes, there are good carbs and bad carbs. As we heard today, everyone agrees that these bad carbs are not good. The lower you go on the carbs per day on the y-axis, the more likely you are to have ketosis. You saw on Dr. Finney's slide, that area where you want to get for optimal ketosis. I don't do that. I just say, let's get down low and let's see what happens. Most people do really well. People come to me for it to work the first time. I say, well, let's do 20 grams or less. Let's just go back to what they were doing 100 years ago. The science looks good, not only for diabetes, but for obesity and hypertension and polycystic ovary syndrome and heartburn and fatty liver and irritable bowel syndrome. We have studies published on all those things. What do you eat? It's unlimited meat, poultry, seafood, and eggs, but I know you're not going to want much. Eat all you want, but I know you're not going to want much because you're not hungry. That's how it works. Limit the foods. At the bottom, 2 cups of salad greens, 1 cup of a non-starchy veggie. Then you get a small amount, limited amount of cheese, mayonnaise, cream, things like that. I think those are limited because they're high in calories. You can eat too many calories on a low-carb diet. It still works by lowering the calories. So, but we don't count them in the teaching. Okay? So you could do bacon and eggs or sugar-free yogurt with berry slices or not eat anything. I think Dr. Fung will talk about that. It's so easy to not eat anything. That's just a great slide. It's so hard not to eat when you're out traveling. And so I'm starting to use that in my teaching, actually. You know, learned a lot from the running on fat as fuel. And by the way, what kind of weight do you want to lose? Fat weight? Yeah, so you want to be a fat-burning machine. That's really helped in the teaching of this for people. So you can do it. I just had a young man, lose 40 pounds in 2 months by eating 2 double cheeseburgers, no bun, at a fast food restaurant. Okay, two of those burgers. You know, Jimmy Moore and I go back and forth on food quality versus carbohydrate quantity, and the main factor in my experience is carbohydrate quantity. And it'd be a shame if someone thought they had to have grass-fed this, organic that, so that therefore they couldn't do it. Because I see it working without regard to any of that, just by lowering the carb quantity. So, but not to say that you shouldn't do those things, just many of my patients can't do it. So what can happen today, and great to see more and more practitioners here using the low-carb ketogenic diet, as we coined the term, or low-carb high-fat diet, as it's coming out of Sweden. 100 units a day, you just add up all the units, a long-acting unit, a short-acting unit, count it the same, a unit from your insulin pump, count it the same. You know, there are now units of insulin that come 500 units per cc. It used to be just 100. So the medication world is trying to go up and up on the insulin. When remember that slide, the pathophysiology of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, there's already too much insulin. So you want to reduce it. So anyway, cut the insulin in half on the first day, otherwise you'll get low blood sugars and they'll blame you for the problem when it was really over-medication. So you have to be careful. I worry about the spouses and the family members of my patients who get taught by me in an hour-long clinic, because if they're on medication and the medication becomes too strong, they're going to think that it was the diet that caused it when actually it was the medication. Important point. But pretty much you cut, unless the glycemic control is way out of bounds, you cut the insulin in half on the first day. When a blood sugar goes down, you cut back on the insulin instead of eating up to meet the insulin. This person came off 100 units of insulin in 6 weeks. So this is a small multiple. I'm going to show a bunch of these. The minimum and maximum glucose at the beginning was 120 to 140. The blood sugar is as good as before, 110 to 130. The person lost 5 pounds over 6 weeks off all of insulin. Not bad, huh? 80 units a day off in 1 week. This person was on insulin, Actos, metformin, other oral medications. Blood sugars as good or better than before on no medication. Add up all the insulin, 60 units off in 2 weeks. Doesn't matter if it's multiple times a day, how long people have had the diabetes, it seems. Off 100 units in 3 weeks, 180 units in 1 week, 160 units, 4 weeks. This person had been on insulin for 25 years. There's no happier patient than the patient who comes off insulin and who has been told they're going to have diabetes forever. I've seen doctors' lives be transformed because they were given tools that didn't work. They cared about their patients, and they started doing this, and their lives have been, now they're happy, going to work, seeing people who are happy. So it's not just a patient being happy, it's a doctor being happy. What if a country could be happy, or a corporation, or a public health system? It's just a matter of time, don't you think? 250, 300 units of insulin off in a month. 500 units of insulin still on after 10 weeks. But this fellow is spending a lot less money. He's in that area where the insurance isn't paying for it, got to pay for it on his own. And I mean, this person's injecting 100 units 5 times a day. It's really kind of obscene. You know, I wish I could say words like you, Andreas. Insane. This is insane. Now, the way I see it is that the food contributes partially to this, but if insulin resistance, the underlying cause for the diabetes, is still there, you may not have normal blood sugar control for a while, okay? So let's see, this person, 140 units, this person's on a pump. Type 1 on a pump, no problem with type 1, you just need a lot less insulin because your insulin or your medication is titrated to the carbohydrate in the diet. You lower the carbohydrates, you lower the insulin. And let's see. Some people say, well, you haven't shown me the hemoglobin A1Cs, which is a measure of 3 months over time. It's okay. Here, the hemoglobin A1C in the y-axis under 6% off medications when the person had an A1C of 9 they had an A1C of 9 for 10 years. Okay, so the x-axis is here in years. So this is not, you really don't need a randomized trial to show that this is effective. What you need is a randomized trial to show that it's safe and not harmful or different than other methods that you use. So the terrible thing would be to have an uncontrolled study, have 1 or 2 random events in a low-carb arm without randomization to know that it was just the process of weight loss or not this particular method of doing it. This is the internist's dream for a treatment. Diabetes, hypertension, GERD, that's heartburn, on the Diabetes Association diet, on insulin and pills, checking blood sugars 4 times a day with an A1C of, 7. People would say that's goal. That's straight endocrinologists would say this person's fixed. On medication, hemoglobin A1C of 7%, now on low-carb, high-fat, low-carb ketogenic diet, however you want to say it, has lost 60 pounds, is off all the medications, has no heartburn, no hypertension, no diabetes. It's so unbelievable, people don't believe it. Honestly. And so that's why I have an open door policy. If you want to come see this as a practitioner, and there are other practitioners around the country, around the world, who will be happy to have you sit in their office. And when I look back, that's how I learned. I went and sat in the office of Dr. Atkins years ago to get me through all of the barriers that you've just heard about today to see the effects that can happen. And then we formalized it into research. Now, I work in a clinical group where other university professors are there and kind of looking, we share patients, and after 2 or 3 patients that I fix, mutual patients, then they refer everybody to me. There's a 4 to 6 month waiting list to come in to see me. I'm sorry about that. But at a university that says you're really in demand and they like that you're so important, people have to wait for you. Not good customer service. But so one of my colleagues down the hall said, gosh, that Westman, he says he can fix diabetes. What if we get someone who's never had any treatment for diabetes? This was a 64-year-old male, BMI, body mass index of 29 kilograms per meter squared. First onset of diabetes with a hemoglobin A1C of 10.5%. There in red. Looking back, the prior one was 5.9%, 3 years before. Just cut the carbs, and so what he says, cut the carbs and I'll send you to Westman, send you to the lifestyle medicine clinic. And the A1C was normal, 5.5%. No medicines used, just dietary change. Maybe Dr. Osler and Dr. Joslin are smiling, looking down, because we're recapitulating through years of insanity, according to Dr. Ian Felt. Basically now having to raise the bar of evidence is pretty high now. In fact, one might argue, it's been argued in editorials, that only pharmaceutical companies can afford the trials to be done to show the evidence. Or you could just come to one of our clinics. Compared to 10 years ago, though, the social climate has changed in the US so that I get very little pushback. Even cardiologists, lipidologists who I speak at national meetings and educating, it's an education barrier at the moment. So instructing people, in summary, instructing people to limit carb grams leads to spontaneous reduction in caloric intake without explicitly limiting the calories. There's a loss of body weight, improvements in glucose, fasting lipid profiles. If you incorporate triglyceride HDL and the total cholesterol HDL ratio, pretty much gets better in everyone. Improvement in systolic blood pressure, reduction in waist circumference. A low-carb diet is the preferred diet for metabolic syndrome and for type 2 diabetes. The prevailing treatment of medications in a high-carb diet was never compared to the low-carb, high-fat diet in clinical research. So the onus is really, there's equipoise now, and the low-carb, high-fat world wants to put this to test, not only for obesity, but for diabetes. And as I learned in Cape Town, South Africa, the athletes are going to be way ahead of all of those researchers here because their outcomes are known immediately. But so we follow that, very interested. What I'm telling you is from my vantage point, treating in a clinical setting, diabetes, hypertension, across all socioeconomic levels, it's pretty amazing how it can work. And it's so amazing, people don't believe it. So. What's new, the Low Carb Summit happened last year in Cape Town. Ketone Therapeutics is in Tampa in January. Low Carb Vail here in February. The Low Carb Cruise is a place where people like-minded get together, hear geeky lectures like mine when you steam from port to port. You can't ski there, but you can scuba dive and that sort of thing. Food Loose in Iceland, and now a San Diego conference. Low carb looks like it's on the radar screen. This is all fantastic. I was frustrated with people getting off track because of all of the other foods out there have been approached, and I'm totally conflicted now with the Adapt Your Life website, which teaches for free, but also sells products that are truly low carb. We're learning more and more, and every person is different, but in most people we've tested now, they don't raise the blood sugar, don't lower the ketone level, these ADAPT products, which is pretty cool. I thank my South African team, ADAPT team, for that. Heal Diabetes Clinics is our attempt to formalize and scale up the low-carb clinic within a setting of a host doctor setting. If you're interested, this one is actually something you can invest in. Check the website out. And if you want to make a difference in any of these ways, this is one way you can actually help out. If enough people, grassroots, funds Heal, I'm gone and I'm at Heal, because we just can't wait for systems to come around with the evidence, the science that's there right now. So thank you very much.